Bum, 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 bum. I'd like to say that I had a good excuse for being late tonight, but I was eating a mango, so I don't know if we'd call that a good excuse or not. It was a good mango. I think they also give me a little bit of heartburn, so that's probably a consequence I'm going to have to face. But mango it was. That is my excuse for being late to the video. Some fruit sitting on the table that's going to go if I don't eat it soon, so I'm trying to... I wonder if I can make it mango salsa. I've got some tomatoes I can use to make, and jalapeno, some onion. I bet you I can make a mango salsa. I should probably look up some suggestions on how to do that. I guess it's just salsa with chunks of mango in it, right? I mean, that's the whole idea. Anyway, I had a little bit of a brainstorm that hit after video last night. Sort of part of what happens when I do these. I hope everything's working right. I got my audio plugged in, yep. When I do these videos, sometimes when I get sick, be a little hard for me to get into the mindset of doing something like this. But once I get going, I get so inspired by ideas that just stuff hits me when I'm least expecting it. Last night we were looking at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and imagining how we could rework that premise again. So it's reworking a reworked idea, because we've done this before. We have previously taken the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, reworked the whole idea, and created a whole new one. What we did before was, instead of 4 turtles through a mutagenic ooze becoming anthropomorphic turtles, we had 3 crows or ravens, I can't even remember specifically, made into the 3 sisters, who were detectives, not ninjas, and they were transformed into anthropomorphic corvids via alien transportation technology. This time, we're taking a look at that list of stories we took from TV and movies and re-examine to create something new, with the caveat that I lost the originals file that I made in a computer crash. I have the videos where I made them, but I'm purposely not revisiting those videos because it's really sort of a playground of the sort of statement that I frequently make, which is, if you give any 2 authors the same building blocks, you will get 2 different stories. And I'm being my own test samples here. I did the first round of taking an idea like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, breaking it down into constituent parts, reworking some of those parts, and assembling into entirely different new stories. And I did it once and got one type of story, and I'm doing it again without much memory of this time. So, and that's not to say you couldn't theoretically the same ground again. Like, I have enough memory in the back of my head, and this isn't like a scientific research project. So I have enough memory in the back of my head to say, like, Jurassic Park was cyberpunk. Ghostbusters was cryptids, I believe, is one of the ones we did. I might have come up with more than one story for the Ghostbusters. And that one we did cryptids, people who found out cryptids were concentrating at one place or another. And something distress beacon by aliens or some such thing. And yeah, anyway, so that was the idea we had before. I imagine if I tried, I could recreate that idea. So if your goal is to recreate something or do something like somebody else is doing, you can do that. And there's occasionally the lucky incident of two people with no connections and no ability to learn from one another having the same idea. Those are all things that happen. But if you're doing it right, if you're not plagiarizing from somebody, your story is going to feel very, very different from somebody else's. And more pertinent to what we're looking at right now, my story now will look different compared to my story yesterday. Or not yesterday, but the previous round. Even if I were trying to actively recreate that idea. So there is a little bit of a bias in getting something different here because I'm actively trying to avoid rehashing the thing I did last time. So that's sort of like the setup for what I'm saying now. So what we have here is last night we worked on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and we said, so that is a story of 4 turtles that start out as animals and become humanoid. So to do something different, we're going to start out with 4 humans. In this case, actually, I think I have 5. We're going to start with any number of humans and make them anthropomorphic something else. And because turtles were animals that became human, if we start with human, we don't want to necessarily, because I want to do something different than what we did, we don't go from human to half animal. That would be easy enough to do with a were creature or werewolf or whatever. What I went with last night was plants of some kind, more specifically trees, as we went into it. So we start with humans that get transformed into anthropomorphic trees. And from there, we started exploring. I was debating whether or not we were going to do fantasy or like a modern fantasy or a urban fantasy setting. Oh gosh, excuse me. And I'm not sure I've even really narrowed it down any other than to say, like, I don't know that I'm going to spend a lot of time debating which category what I make fits into. It's not necessary for what I'm going for. Once I started to get a sense for what the story and idea was behind this, the differentiation between something like a Harry Potter's wizarding world that runs parallel with ours and a more, I don't know if we'd call it Dresden Files, where, or even to a certain degree, sort of like a little bit like the cryptids and the conspiracy theories that are out there. They don't require that you have a secondary world that offshoots from our own. It's just kept secret. So I think it's almost more like a Hellboy situation. Like Hellboy, I think that sort of feels kind of right. Hellboy, at least from the movies. I don't think I've read much of the comics. I think I read 1 or 2 of the comics. Hellboy starts with the premise of the modern world is kept largely unaware of. So almost Men in Black, too, is kept largely unaware of the supernatural events going on around them because they're people in positions to keep it that way. So if we started with a premise like that, it doesn't matter whether this is, you know, a wizarding world, you walk through wardrobes into Narnia, sort of pocket dimension world, or if this is just full on, it's kept secret behind the woodwork where we are. So we'd start with that premise of a world like that, in which some of that secret hidden stuff leaks out and contaminates the lives of 5, I think is where I settled, children. I haven't even yet decided whether or not I'm going to settle on just females or some male and female children. The trick going into this is how much of what I am thinking do I reveal from the start? Like, I feel like in the beginning of the Ninja Turtles, and I never read the original comics, it's always presumed that you start in the middle of the story. Where in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it's the teenage turtle ninjas save a news reporter from a group of gang members or something like that. I am sorry I'm yawning so much tonight. I am really tired. I don't know what the deal is. But they save the news reporter, and we sort of join the story of the Turtles at the point of the news reporter who joins their story. So that premise is sort of a good way to adventure with such characters. If we do that with what we're doing here, where we have these adolescents who are not quite human, or not really remotely human at this point, if you really look at it, and they're mystical champions fighting dark, mysterious entities that are interacting with the human world, or sort of like a vampire hunter. Actually, you know, a good comparison would be like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer setting, and the Angel and that sort of stuff. The Angel Detective Agency, or whatever the sequel to Buffy was. That idea of they solve the goings on in the background of the city, and starting the characters off in a way that introduces somebody to them that acts as a stand-in for the reader, or viewer, I guess. I don't know that this is going to be a viewer situation. This isn't going to be an animated short, I don't think. Unless somebody wants to make an animated short or a puppet short. But you introduce somebody who's an outsider to that situation that gets pulled in, and we are brought into the story with them, and we're brought into the story in the middle of it. So these teenage ensorcelled dryad. No, it's teenage ensorcelled hunter dryads. I might actually see if I can even swap that around a little bit in some way to get a actual word. I'll have to rethink that maybe. But what we have here is sort of the way I envision it. And there's a visual element, a strong visual element in my head about this, is you have the kids that are, they really have been training dryads in a sacred grove to be a defender of humanity from the fey elements or the monstrous elements. I can't quite decide whether or not I want it to be like gremlins and other little grabbly monsters and magical consequences bubbling up through the city in a very sort of Dresden way, or if I would rather it be something a little bit different, like vampire hunting, or maybe something along the lines of pixies and other problems. I may not even make a huge distinction for a lot of it. I may just establish it as they are a group, a militia of those that fight the things that go bump in the night. Be they elvish, dwarvish, trollish, or Cthulhu themed. And their origin is, it's sort of dark and tragic is what I'm thinking. The way I want it to start out is basically, and this is where I got into the question of, if we start in the middle, I don't reveal a lot of this from the get-go. But I like the premise of basically almost going Peter Pan with it a little bit. These are kids that are lost children that got in a place where they were being chased and endangered by a monster. And they managed to find the grove, but the grove became sort of a prison. The grove was a place where they could live for a period of time, but they couldn't get out of it because of the danger of the things that were hunting them. And so they sort of became these lost children in the grove. Now, there is an element of this that I wanted to sort of play with, which was the idea that these children of the grove, you cannot survive in a small grove off of the bare minimum of what those groves bring out. So nuts and apples and berries and that sort of thing. One child would have a hard time surviving on that. 5 wouldn't survive at all. And so the premise I want to potentially play with a little bit is the idea didn't survive. That the grove was where they went to find refuge and hide from the monsters. But they died hiding. So you have these 5 children that died hiding in a grove. And Dryads are usually a spirit that are bound into a tree. So a nymph or a spirit of some kind bound into a tree, or bonded to a tree. I don't want to say bound, but if something like that took pity on these children and found a way to sort of make them their children by binding their spirits into a sapling that they started growing from seeds. That idea of these children's spirits inhabiting mobile plants or mobile trees and becoming fighters against the monsters that hunt children. That's sort of where I'm going with it. It's a little bit grimdark, but what I ended up doing was taking that idea of, over time, I didn't want like 5 children just out of nowhere. I might go back and, I give myself a little room to go back and say, like, maybe it literally was 5 street urchins at one point who were hunted by a monster and they all took refuge all at the same time. But I think it's more practical to think of them as multiple victims of this monster, all becoming a group together. And what I want to do for them is to also have them sort of forget who they were before. And they're being raised by the dryads to also train them to be champions against the monsters. So you have these 5 kids, and I want to do it in such a way that, like, the thing about the turtles that makes them distinct is they don't look human. They're not human. They don't blend in during the weekdays, and then on the weekends they shed their disguises and look like turtles. That's not what we want to do. And if we're taking that same concept and going in the direction of dryads, you're going to want to make them look inhuman and always be inhuman. So it's like they're not going to be able to put a little makeup on and blend with society and get a day job at the temp agency or something like that. They're just not part of our society. And what I had in mind was going a little along the lines of, imagine a sort of symbiotic suit of armor. I would almost say the equivalent of this in the comics would be Witchblade, where a human gets a bracelet or a gauntlet that converts into a whole suit of armor. Now that one's a little bit of like, what is it, cheesecake? But going along a similar premise of having this sense of a whole suit of mystical armor made out of a living thing that encases and covers and makes a whole suit. Now, if you did that in such a way that there's a full face plate, a full body armor, then you could give them a humanoid form, and they are that armor. They aren't covered in the armor. The wood didn't grow over them. They are the wood that has grown and shaped itself into a suit of armor, an animated suit of armor made of wood, mystical wood, that they control to a certain degree. So armor and their weapons, we've got wood. So I'm working with the idea of spear, bow and arrow, maul or giant mallet, daggers, and vine whip sort of situation, or lasso. And so you have 5 options for weapons and training with them. And they're not particularly ninja-ish, which is kind of on purpose. I don't want it to be a ninja. I want them to be sort of like what's a good example of that? It's not quite Highlander, where you're hunting the supernatural enemies with a sword in modern day world, but along those lines. I think somebody with a spear, somebody with a hammer, a bow and arrow, daggers, and vine lashes are a suitably melee arcane weapon choice for what they're doing. But it also provides the fact that each of them could be made out of wood. So it's not just that they have these things, it's that they can grow these things when they need them. So somebody in a suit of light armor, thin, light, form-fitting armor that allows them to move freely and easily, holds up a hand and a bow grows in that hand, and arrows grow in a quiver on their back, and they pull arrows and launch them. And the fletching on the arrows is leaves, and the points on the arrow are thorns or something to that effect. And like, that totally works. And you can use some very intricately like carved or twisting woodwork or natural grain patterns in wood for some of the designs of the armor and the weapons. And I love this idea of these wooden fighters with weapons of wood. And it has its inbuilt weaknesses. So chopping, burning, sawing, sort of situations are viable means of making them so that they're not, made out of steel. But so you have these kids that are fleeing monsters, hiding in a grove, maybe venturing out to try to get things to survive. But they pass time in the grove trying to learn secrets from the dryads that protect them. And time passes where they train, and over that time, they more gradually just turn into those wooden warriors. And at a certain point, they begin venturing out and hunting the hunters, the monsters that go bump in the night. And that's backstory that you release a little bit at a time over weeks or months of storytelling. But you start with them being trained warriors and fighting monsters and being discovered by the surrogate for us. Somebody who's an outsider to their world of chaos and crazy, stumbling in or getting dragged in against their will to a circumstance where they meet and learn about these 5 teenagers, I guess. And that's sort of where I think we need to go with it. Now, there's still some minor refinements needed for that, in which we look at what are they opposing, or how do they get their cases, or where do they learn? Do they build a network that informs them of what's going on in the city around them so that they can try to figure out how to do what they do. Like, potentially we could do it so that they protect humans from humans using dark rituals or something. They protect humans from malicious fairies and elves and such, and they protect humans from Cthulhu-like mythos monsters. And you don't have to pick any of that. Like, I do think that there's a certain part of it that, like, vampires should play a big part, because you're dealing with trees. So their weapons to fight are essentially variously formed stakes. So I feel like that suits it really well. But I don't know that that's the only focus that there should be. I feel like we could start with the premise of that their predominant opponents, the monsters that were chasing them, and things like that, would be vampires in a sort of, if you did, what was it, Underworld, where there's the vampire clans that live within the city and manipulate things from the shadows. If you had that sort of situation where there were these clans and these sort of vampire mafia running games from behind the scenes, having some roving gangs of vampire hoodlums trying to wrangle kids, and kids go missing all the time, it's not thought a lot of. You could totally start from that premise and still allow for other creatures to become things to play with. So their focus is vampire hunters. But they also do all sorts of mystical, monstrous, and fey creatures. Yeah, I think starting with just their equivalent of the Foot Clan would be the vampire clans. But they're not the only thing that they fight. All right, that's fair enough. I think that's a pretty good place to go with for starting from tonight. I think tomorrow we'll pick another idea from one of the other stories that we want to reboot. And I think that's what I'm calling it tonight. I'm super sore, so I'm going to say have a good one. I will catch you in the next one. And until then, I think I have to keep popping out here to grab this because I do enough stuff with this computer during the day that I don't have it. Take care and have a good. Did I leave that on private or public or what? I'm almost certain I screwed that up